Authenticity Radio.
You are listening to Slade Suter.
Hi, this is Ronald D. Moore, writer of Star Trek and Battlestar Galactica, and you are listening to Authenticity Radio with Slade Suter.
Hey, welcome. Grab a seat anywhere. No, we don't have any menus. The only thing we have today is the freedom to express who you truly are. We call it Authenticity Radio. You'll like it, don't worry. Let me go grab the host. He's got the hospitality of a fat and jolly innkeeper. He's a good guy. Slade Suter.
And thank you for joining us today. This is Slade Suter. And I am broadcasting from the Authenticity Radio Studios.
It winds from Chicago to LA. It's more than 2,000 miles all the way. Say you get your kicks on Route 66.
And today's topic is the cultural evolution.
Joplin, Missouri.
Oklahoma City looks.
Did I say revolution? No, I didn't. I said cultural evolution. And philosopher Dr. Lou Marinoff is joining us yet again on Authenticity Radio to shed light on what is the cultural evolution. Now, Dr. Lou Marinoff is a philosopher and an author and a philosophic practitioner. He is currently professor and chair of the Department of Philosophy at City College in New York City. Dr. Marinoff is also the founding president of the American Philosophic Practitioners Association. As I mentioned before, he has authored many books: A Fair New World, Plato, Not Prozac, Philosophical Practice, and I really enjoyed this one, Therapy for the Sane, The Middle Way, The Power of the Tao, and The Inner Philosopher. Now, Dr. Lou Marinoff, welcome back to Authenticity Radio.
Thank you very much, Slade. It's great to be with you again. We had a very friendly and fun interview in Barcelona just, I guess, last month, right?
Yeah, we did. Just for our listeners, Dr. Lou Marinoff was invited to speak at the 6th International Congress of Conflictology and Peace here in Barcelona. And he granted me a quick on-the-fly interview of the greater self and lesser self.
So we did. If I just may interject to give your listeners some context, I was invited to that conference to talk about the biological factors that predispose human beings to come into conflicts, and that's really at all levels, whether it's interpersonal or conflicts with our family, friends, neighbors, ourselves, or indeed, unfortunately, international conflicts which escalate into very destructive affairs. But essentially, there are biological factors that, as I say, predispose, but to not condemn us necessarily to come into violent conflict with one another. So at that conference, we were exploring some of the roots of conflict, in the biological domain, and that leads very naturally to a consideration of cultural factors, which are, both able to exacerbate but also to ameliorate the situation. It's culture, by and large, that will determine whether our conflicts are resolved peacefully or otherwise. Okay, so that's the importance of discussing cultural evolution.
Okay, so cultural evolution is our approach. It's like it's an airport, and we're making an approach to it. And it's important to understand that cultural evolution is actually layered on top of genetic evolution. Is that correct?
Yes. I mean, that we've made enormous strides in particularly the 20th century in biology. The Darwin's discoveries and his thesis, and then subsequently the discovery of genetics, and all of the amazing work that's been done in biology in the 20th and into the 21st century has given us an ever clearer picture of what we share with other animals, all the other species. If Darwin is correct, we're all descended from a single primordial form. And of course, as we look at our nearest living relatives, the great apes, we see there also a lot of biological factors which predispose them and us, to come into conflict. But we're different from the other animals in one very significant way, and that is in the size of our big brains and the fact that our big brains are really, if they have a purpose, which I certainly hope they do, it's not an accident, that nature somehow has favored the brain getting bigger and bigger in our, in our species. So the purpose of this big brain, if it has one, is to learn. We are fundamentally a learning animal. That's not a surprise or a secret. But what really is sort of new and what needs to be more clearly understood by people is the idea that, as you've put it very, very, very well, that we're really subject to two different kinds of processes at once. The biological part, which we can't really control that much, and it's a very long and slow-moving process. Genetic evolution takes a long time, whereas culture takes a very short time. We are all exposed. If you want an analogy, we could say like the big brain, the human brain, is something like a hardware platform, a computer hardware platform, or wetware in this case. But what is loaded into it is cultural software.
That's a nice way of looking at it.
It's a helpful analogy because it makes people, so you could understand that a newborn human baby, for example, is biologically predisposed to learn language, which is our primary way of, communicating, understanding, thinking, everything. So important. And yet there is no biological determination about what language a person's going to speak. That depends where you're born and what language you're exposed to, or what languages you're exposed to, yeah? So the human brain is so amazing because, the biology of the brain is not different. We're all one species. But look what cultural programs do to us. They make us appear so different to each other, so sometimes alien to one another, that we often fall into this mistake of not recognizing each other as human, of demonizing others, or, that sort of thing can happen. So this is basically the power of cultural programming. It's extremely important to understand this.
It's kind of fun to look at it that way. You can see that there's the programming has kind of gotten away. It's taken on a life of its own, and the programmers are struggling to catch up, to keep up.
Yeah, and there are a lot of programmers. There are a lot of influencers vying for control of your, executive functions. You've got politicians and religious groups and, private interest groups, the private sector, advertising. There are all kinds of people who are wanting to, with all different kinds of agendas, wanting to lay claim to your cognitive processes to get their images and their messages and their slogans deeply embedded into your operating system, so that you'll basically, be harnessed to their purposes rather necessarily than to your own.
I imagine that's where we spend most of our time as humanity, trying to decipher what has been embedded and what is really our own programming. So, Albert Korzybski is an influential person to you, is it not?
Oh, how did you ferret this out?
Well, actually, I was reading some of your old articles before the interview.
Oh.
So he's a great thinker as far as general semantics goes.
Yes.
And his catchphrase is, the map is not the territory.
Yes. That's the most famous bumper sticker, of course, from Korzybski, right?
So you're standing on the shoulders of giants, just like Isaac Newton.
Yeah. Well, yes, but let me just digress for your listeners. This might be because that quote by Newton is very often repeated, and I've seen this far because I stood on the shoulders of giants. It sounds like he's being very humble and according, praise to the great scientists who preceded him. There weren't really that many preceding him, but many more came after. Let me tell you an inside story, okay?
Please, go ahead.
This is a bit of a digression, but, in fact, Newton had many rivals and competitors in the day. It was, the Enlightenment. There were all kinds of people working in all kinds of areas that didn't all agree, as today scientists don't all agree. Leibniz co-invented the calculus, although it's Newton's notation that we use now, so he more or less gets credit. But there were all kinds of other people out there doing different things, and one of them was Robert Hooke, who was a great physicist in his own right. And in fact, we have Hooke's law. Hooke was studying the elastic properties of springs and other harmonic devices. So basically, Hooke's laws having to do with extension and compression and oscillation of certain kinds of devices was was something that we've inherited as well. F equals kx. The force on a spring is going to be proportional to its extension or compression. But basically, Hooke and Newton disagreed on some things. And they had some quite, I think, vituperative public disagreements as well. They really got into it with each other, and maybe they didn't like each other that much either, or who knows. So they were kind of rivals. And the thing is that Hooke was actually a kind of dwarf congenitally. He had a kind of dwarfism, so he was an extremely short, sort of a stunted guy.
Oh.
Okay, so when Newton talked about standing on the shoulders of giants, this was a very nasty cut at whatever else it was. It was an opportunity to take a kind of a sideswipe at Robert Hooke. That's the insider story. Okay.
Well, there's the other side of the cloud.
Yeah. So Newton wasn't all sweetness and light. He had a pretty acerbic wit too.
Well, apparently so.
Yeah.
Poor Robert.
Yeah, well, I think Hooke was okay. I mean, we still have Hooke's laws, right? We have Newton's laws, we have Hooke's laws, This thing with biology predisposes us to be competitors, how we got out of the caves and why we're talking by satellite, because we have this drive to compete with each other. But let me illustrate for you, if I may, just one of the main differences between the biological evolution and cultural evolution, so our listeners can really get a handle on this, all right? We talked about the computer analogy. You understand this? The brain is a computer, but what operating system is it running? Well, that depends on culture, okay? What languages are being loaded into it, what beliefs, and all the rest. That's dependent on culture. So here's another thing to consider, that in the biological domain, we have Darwin and neo-Darwinism. That gives us a very good explanation of how things work biologically. But one of Darwin's main rivals for a long time was Lamarck, because people were putting forward in the 19th century. There were various kinds of theories of biological evolution that were being advanced, and the most famous rival to Darwin was Lamarck. Lamarck was French, and presented his work on the philosophy of evolution to, in fact, Emperor Napoleon. He was a bit before Darwin. So Lamarck's theory is as follows. Lamarck said that basically he thought that we were able to pass on to our offspring traits that we had acquired from outside during our lifetimes, and that these would get passed on. So the famous example would be if you wanted to breed mice without tails, for whatever reason, right? So Darwin will tell you, and the correct way to do it would be to start selectively breeding mice which already have very short tails, right? Because whatever that is some kind of gene, that's going to determine the tail length. That's Darwin's explanation, but he didn't know about genes. But he knew there was something going on internally. And he said, so if you keep breeding short-tailed mice, and you keep selecting the ones with the shortest tails, and keep rebreeding them, eventually you're going to breed mice with the shortest possible tails. And in fact, this is what happens with animal husbandry, right? When you're breeding pigeons or cows or dogs or whatever animal, people have known this. It's called selective breeding. Without knowing the genetic theory, they were still able to understand that something was going on, which enabled them to get this result by selective breeding.
Right.
Lamarck had this other idea, which turns out to be pretty wrong most of the time. And his idea was, well, if you can pass on inherited traits, that means what we could do is we could take some normal mice, cut their tails off, and breed them. And then, we're going to still get mice with tails. Okay, cut their tails off and breed them. And Lamarck thought that eventually they would, quote-unquote, learn, to give birth to mice without tails because of having their own tails chopped off, okay?
I'm sure the PETA people would be all over him today.
Well, there's a lot of implications to this, and you know, if your mind goes into overdrive, you could see how this could be taken to some very wrong. Now, listen, this is caused huge amount of human suffering in the world. Firstly, it's scientifically completely wrong. That's not how things work, right? Only in rare cases. I mean, there are cases where you can inherit something that's been acquired biologically. For example, let's suppose a woman becomes addicted to, cocaine and becomes pregnant and gives birth to a baby, and all the time she's using, the substance. It's indeed possible, unfortunately, for her offspring to inherit an addiction.
Yeah, I can see that. However, it seems like this is more like the exception, though. Yes.
But that's a special case, right? That's a very, very special kind of case. It's not generally the case that this is, how biological evolution works. But consider this. It's exactly how cultural evolution works. Because where do we get language from? We acquired it externally, and we pass it on. So all the stuff that we learn by virtue of this big learning brain we have, all the stuff that we learn, that we need to learn to get by in life, we pass on to our children. And then they take it hopefully a step further and so forth. So actually cultural evolution is Lamarckian. Lamarck only saw a little glimmering of that. He thought he was talking about biology. It turns out that he's totally wrong about biology, but totally right about culture. And Darwin the other way around, okay? Darwin did not attempt to do cultural evolution. People need to understand that there's a big demarcation here. In fact, I'll tell you something else interestingly, from the history of science, that Karl Marx wrote to Darwin. They were contemporaries.
Really?
Oh, yes. And Marx, wrote Das Kapital, his magnum opus. He wrote it in the British Library. And when he finished it, he was sensible enough to want good endorsers. Like every author, he wanted a good blurb for his book, right? So he actually wrote to Darwin, because he had finished Das Kapital not long after Darwin, became an immediate and huge success with the publication of The Origin of Species in 1859. So Marx wanted Darwin's endorsement on Das Kapital. And I saw this correspondence. When I studied, 100 years later or more, I was in the British Library too. So I ran across their correspondence. And Darwin refused politely to endorse Marx's book. And what he said to Marx was, my theories, he said, Darwin said, my theories pertain only to the vegetable and animal kingdoms, not to political ones.
That's very interesting.
So isn't that interesting?
Well, yeah, because it seems like he was already sensing the cultural evolution.
Yes, Darwin already had, obviously this notion, although he didn't articulate it as such, but it's very clear his theories pertain to biology but not to culture. And so he didn't want to endorse Marx because he didn't want anybody getting carried away thinking that, Darwinism could be applied to societies and to politics, which is exactly what Herbert Spencer did. We ended up with it anyway, Slade. It's called social Darwinism. But it was Herbert Spencer's doing, and Darwin never approved of it. So what's really interesting is that phrases like survival of the fittest, Darwin never said that.
That was Spencer? I didn't know that.
Really? No, most people believe that Darwin said that. That was Herbert Spencer. And he was using, or rather abusing, Darwin's biological theories to justify, British imperialism and other kinds of cultural imperialism. So it was Spencer who was the culprit, and he was talking about survival of the fittest, and he was also, Darwin never used the word evolution either, interestingly enough. In his first 5 editions of The Origin of Species, the word never occurs. It's only posthumously that they stuck it in. Darwin said descent with modification. That was his phrase, which is a very accurate phrase, considering it's the genetic stuff that's getting modified. What you said is exactly right. So Darwin understood there was a difference between biological evolution, which was where he was working, and cultural evolution, where he was not working. And Lamarck had it the other way around. Lamarck thought his theories were explaining biological evolution, but actually they were very good at explaining cultural evolution. You just never know how stuff is going to unfold.
So Lamarck was hot on the heels of cultural evolution, but he seems to have missed the culture part. Korzybski mentioned in general semantics that there's 2 ways of bringing in information. There's language, then there's our nervous system.
Yep.
So considering cultural evolution, this is our way of learning.
Yes, it is. And I mean, the nervous system is biological, but we are born immature. And this was Stephen Jay Gould's insight. Some 20th century paleontologists like Gould and others began to understand what's so unique about people is that nature's had to make this huge compromise with our species precisely because the brain is so big. If we were born at a comparable time in our neurological maturity, let's say comparable to monkeys and chimps, who pretty much have to get around very quickly after birth. Other animals have to be on their feet and move with the herd almost within an hour. You know, if you're talking about grazing animals, herding animals, like deer or antelope or giraffes or elephants, any of those animals, the babies have to get on their feet right away, right? They're born, they have to get on their feet, like within minutes, and suckle from a standing position, and they have to be able to move with the herd almost, within a matter of an hour or two. They've got to start moving around. Well, we're nowhere close to that. Look how long it takes a human baby to take its first steps, like a year, right? That's because we're born neurologically immature. Monkeys don't scramble around in trees right off the bat, but they can at least cling onto their mother's fur right away after birth. We can't do that either. We're really totally helpless. Why? Because we're neurologically immature. Why? Because if we were born with the same neurological maturity as these other social animals, the gestation period for the human would be 18 months and not 9.
Wow.
Yes, which means no woman could give birth. I mean, it would be just a nightmare giving birth to such a big brain baby. So nature's way of compromising is that it extends gestation for as long as it's sort of feasible, for the woman to be able to actually give birth, and even then, the woman's pelvis is angled, to accommodate this huge big brain creature, and human birthing is notoriously difficult at times, or painful, I've been told, and I'm not the only husband probably to have been cursed at in the delivery room, right?
I thought I was the only one. You too?
Yeah, me too. But this is because nature's compromise. The baby can't be born much later, or it would be even harder, and it can't be born much earlier, or it's not viable. Right? We push that technology now, where immature infants can be looked after, much better than they used to be. But this is basically 9 months is nature's compromise point. But then we need another 9 months to become more or less, 9 months to a year, we're more or less beginning to show a little bit more neurological maturity. But that's the whole point. Now, Korzybski was looking at this neurologically and linguistically. We also start assimilating language really from day one. And we speak with greater facility as we go through this plastic period and can learn many languages. But Korzybski's insight was that in addition to learning how to communicate, we also learn prejudices and hatreds and just simply stupid opinions that people have, which are wrong. And we pass on this stuff. We all inherit psychological baggage, in other words.
So this could be looked at as we're carrying around legacy stories that don't actually belong to us. In a way. But we are an animal which tells stories, and we need to tell stories, and the oral traditions and mythopoetic traditions are, sometimes very beautiful, inventing stories about to explain how we got here and where we're going and what the world is. We need that kind of stuff. But basically what Korzybski said is that language is, he called it a lubricant with emery. Emery being this abrasive stuff you use, like emery boards and emery paper. It's an abrasive. And lubricant because we use language to socially lubricate our way through life. I mean, we greet people, we have all kinds of conventions, and more than that, we have meaningful conversations with people. And it's very much, language can be the very thing that makes everything else happen. Dialogue is indeed a lubricant. It makes human relations much more friendly and loving and understanding. If we can talk to each other, we have a chance. And even people who are, think that they're each other's enemies, if you can bring them to the table, and the power of dialogue is such that it can overcome misunderstanding. So language is very positive. But, as he said, it's a lubricant with emery, because we will have injected into us, along with our learning of language, there will be pejorative terms. There will be, we will denigrate others. We will demonize others. We will have all this other stuff injected into our, into our linguistic acquisition, and that will be setting up future conflicts down the road. And those are cultural problems. Those are not biological ones. Yeah, so the form of Emery that we're dealing with here is kind of like a form of an identity crisis, is a human race, a human culture. We kind of have an identity crisis, so to speak.
Yes. And what I really like about secular humanistic philosophy, and there are many, there are Western and Asian versions of this, is that it's telling us a philosophy like Buddhism, for example, interpreted in a secular way, not a religious way, is telling us that we all have something fundamental in common. Our most interesting and enlightened selves, in fact, are common to everybody. It's, to be human means to be more than whatever your language group or your passport or your citizenship or, whatever flag you fly. I mean, we need those. That's tribalism. That belongs to our biological heritage. Tribes are the earliest ways in which people manage to come together and survive. But with technologies, and that's cultural, technologies have allowed tribes now to become huge, like entire nations are really tribes, in a sense. And in fact, religious communities, which are international tribes, are, have huge sway over people's lives. But secular humanist philosophies of various kinds will tell us that, in fact, to be human means to have an essential human nature which is independent of the particular language or cultural orientation, that we're brought up in. And that's the thing we need to get in touch with. It's our best selves, back to our earlier conversation. It doesn't matter what your operating system says, whether you're born in China or India or Arabia or Russia or Brazil or Canada or wherever, or Spain. I mean, that's that's kind of accidents of birth. And whatever language and whatever customs you happen to be imbued with by your culture, whatever operating system is loaded into your brain, is a kind of accident of where you happen to find yourself.
We certainly didn't put an order in and choose, did we?
Yeah. No, we didn't choose that. We could choose our friends, but we didn't choose our families, right? And we didn't choose our first language. That was all happening to us before we had any say in it. And most people don't choose their religion either. Initially, at least, we all get, we get a religion loaded in with all the rest. And later on, we are empowered as adults. I guess when you turn 18, more or less, the state says, okay, now you can modify your operating system on your own, right? Like 18 means, okay, you don't have to do everything your parents say, or you could, change religions or change political parties or vote for who you want, right? So 18 is like a demarcation point, yeah? Mm-hmm. Where they're saying, now you're responsible for your own cultural software. But, of course, if you're brainwashed, it is very hard to be responsible, right?
That's kind of a fun way of looking at it. We're unbrainwashing ourselves. We're in process of taking charge of our own programming, so to speak.
Yeah, that's right. We're self-programming. At this point, they say, okay, you're in charge of your own upgrades, like software upgrades. You take care of it, Okay. Although we're going to go to school and we're going to get more, indoctrination and hopefully education. But the thing is, we're deemed to be more responsible for what's in our operating systems. So this is all a cultural thing. I mean, wherever you happen to be born. So this is Korzybski's point as well, that language is a lubricant with Emery. And, you have people like Gandhi who are also picking up on this, not that he read Korzybski, but one of Gandhi's famous sayings is that in the dictionary of Satyagraha, the nonviolent, resistance to oppression that he developed, which convinced the British to leave India, that's amazing, without an army, without firing a shot. But he said in the dictionary of Satyagraha, there is no word for enemy.
Wow, no enemies? I love that.
Wow, yeah. We don't need enemies. It's not a fact of biological life that human beings have to have enemies. This is a cultural convention only, and it could be eradicated by cultural means.
Say more about this, Lou, because there's so many conflicts on this planet today where they're so complicated, people are saying that it's impossible for resolution. So eradicating enemies from our lives seems so foreign.
So what happens in nature is that lions and hyenas are enemies, right? Because they're competing for the same animals that they want to eat, and they're both, hyenas are more scavengers, although they can hunt very well. Lions tend to be the hunters, and then, hyenas can gang up on them and take away their food, and they're competitors and enemies pretty much by nature, and they cannot sit down and make agreements with each other because they don't have language. So human beings, Gandhi's thesis is, and this was Buddha's thesis, and this is the thesis of Immanuel Kant and other humanistic Western philosophers too, is that we do not have natural enemies as such amongst ourselves. We are one species biologically, and there's no need for us to kill each other. Wars are not biologically mandated. The fact is we are predisposed to conflict because we all have desires and we're competitive and we're also cooperative too. Both. It's not one or the other. It's not just, black or white. There are many shades of gray. But the idea of an enemy is definitely a social construction. If you look at countries which have been at peace for a long time, they don't even remember, when they were at war. Norway and Sweden, have been at peace for so long, they don't consider each other enemies.
So history remembers, however, the present no longer carries a live charge. The experience of enemies and wars no longer alive with them.
No, it's not alive with them. England and France had centuries of conflict, right? Every other war in Europe, England and France were involved in it, and now they have this umbilicus under the channel. I was amazed they're connected by this tunnel. So, in a sense, it's going to be harder for them to be enemies again because they're joined in a technological way, right?
Yeah.
And, Canada and the U.S., the Brits invaded in 1812. We had the War of 1812. This is the last time that there was any kind of military action going on between Canada and the U.S. It's unthinkable today for most of us to think, Canada and the U.S. could be at war. Just we have the longest undefended border in the world. You know that? Mm-hmm. Although that border is tighter now than it used to be, that's because of fears, I guess, of, terrorists crossing over. But relations between Canada and the U.S. are very uniformly peaceful and have been for almost 2 centuries, or actually 2 centuries as we speak. So I think this is a question of culture. If you grow up and as a very young child, if you were taught that, the people who live on the other side of the river, or the people who live on the other side of the mountain or whatever they are, they're enemies, well, this is how you're going to think. Because that's the program. That's the program. But on the other hand, if you're taught that people come into conflict for reasons which, may be to them justifiable at the time, it's not biological imperative. And in fact, we are certainly able to live in peace and harmony with one another if we have the will to do it.
So right there would be our next ingredient, the will of peace.
Totally. Political will is essential to all of this. Absolutely all of this.
So how would the will of peace show itself in an example, in very sticky conflict? For example, Israel and Palestine. Mm-hmm. So when you have such a territorial and ideological dispute, it's so complicated, how does the will of peace show itself? Or would the political will of peace be the beginning of the end of the conflict?
That's the beginning. And as you say, it's unfortunately, in the Middle East, it's more complicated than anywhere else because you've got these wrathful Abrahamic faiths involved, very bloodthirsty, I'm sorry to say. But basically, there was a chance. There have been several chances for, and the larger Arab-Israeli conflict has unfortunately at times exacerbated the Israeli-Palestinian problem. If the Israelis and the Palestinians had been left entirely to their own devices, they could have resolved things by now. But because of the larger context of the Middle East, there has been, this other problem, which people also don't realize. I think that the media does a great disservice in portraying the complexities of the Middle East by trying to oversimplify them. So remember that when the United Nations recognized the State of Israel in 1948, they recognized 2 states. It was a very crazy map drawn up by British mapmakers, but they said, look, here's a way in which there can be a state for the Jews and a state for the Palestinian Arabs, and the two can live, side by side. And the Jews accepted it, but the Palestinians didn't at the time. And then Israel was attacked by 5 Arab armies, so had to defend itself just to survive. And unfortunately, that was one problem. The 6-Day War really complicated things when Israel ended up taking over the so-called occupied territories, and then it became viewed as an oppressor rather than, just trying to survive. So that was a very, very severe identity shift for the Israelis. The Palestinians came really close with the Oslo Accords. Clinton said that, Clinton really did great work in trying to, I guess every American president inherits this job, right? They're supposed to try and solve that problem. Nobody has. Clinton came very close. It was Arafat, I really believe, who did not at the end want to do it. It was the political will that he lacked. because I think they could have had a two-state solution at that point. Then you have a problem with Israeli politics. It's a democracy. You're going to have doves sometimes as leaders. You're going to have hawks sometimes as leaders, right? So you have to deal with that. But basically, there has to be a two-state solution, and this is a question of both sides having political will at the same time in order to negotiate it.
Okay, so in talking about social will, how do we begin to dismantle social construct that we've already constructed? So is there a way that we can back off or undo what has already been done?
Well, we backed off from look at the Cold War. I mean, I grew up during, I was a schoolboy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I'll never forget that. That was like, when I started to study conflicts, like, why did I get interested in this? I got interested in this because I was sitting in a classroom in grade 7, I think it was, and Kennedy had just been assassinated. Do you remember that? We thought that was going to be World War III. We didn't know who had done it at first. But even the year before, you had this Cuban Missile Crisis. And we were sitting in the classroom, and we had one of our teachers come in and say, when the Russian ships were steaming, the Soviet ships rather were steaming to Cuba, and they had missiles on board, and the Americans had set up a blockade in the Caribbean. You remember this? You're probably too young, but Kennedy said, we will not allow any Russian ships to pass through this naval blockade. These are international waters. And they said, but we're not going to allow Russian, or Soviet ships to bring missiles into Cuba. So this was the brink. Khrushchev fortunately pulled back. But there was a time when we were all getting ready for World War III and a massive nuclear exchange, which would have killed probably everybody. And they came into the classroom, Slade. The teacher, they said to us, we have somebody listening to the radio. They said, someone's monitoring, the radio. So they said, if anything happens, we're going to send you all home.
That's a good plan.
Yeah, right. That was plan A, right? I think plan B was this duck and cover nonsense where you'd go hide under your desk in case you're hit with 100 megaton airburst. You take refuge under your desk, in the class. But basically,
how frightening! Jeez.
Yeah, and we were just kids, we were kids, and this sword of Damocles, this nuclear sword of Damocles, was hanging over our heads. And I'm saying to myself, if they're going to send us home. I say, it takes about 15 minutes for a missile to reach us, if it's launched. It takes me a half hour to get home, so I'm not going to get home, so...
You're probably thinking about what shelters were available halfway home.
Right. Are there any fallout shelters on the way? Or what? No, but it made us think, and what it did, it made me think, so how do we get here? And the other great irony, and I'm sure lots of, people who were kids then went through this, and the curriculum hadn't changed. I mean, we're still studying these subjects, right? Whatever they are. We're studying English and Latin and chemistry and, all these. We're studying these subjects as though nothing had changed in the world. And there was no discussion of the crisis. There was no subject in our classroom who was actually addressing the question of how the heck did we get into this problematic spot and how we're going to get ourselves out of it. No one was discussing this.
So what is even more amazing is that life is depending on a resolution.
Yes.
Because what's the alternative? Was that MAD? Mutually assured destruction? Isn't that what it's called?
Right, that's what it was called. And remember, deterrence theory, it's still scary. And deterrence only works until it fails. And if it ever fails, it never worked, right? Mm-hmm. It's a very, very strange conception. And it also assumes rational actors. And you have to realize that at the time, we fortunately did have rational actors in the sense that certainly Kennedy and his administration, they did not want to see a nuclear war. They did not want the United States to be destroyed by nuclear weapons, nor did they particularly want to destroy the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons. They didn't. And Khrushchev, I'm sure, did not want his people destroyed either, nor did he want to destroy the United States. They were just lured into this arms race. It's a prisoner's dilemma, and they were lured into it. It's very difficult to get out of it. But basically, they did not wish for this to happen, which was, again, a big factor in it not happening, okay? Whereas we cannot be sure today, just because the Cold War is over, there are still nuclear weapons proliferating as we speak, and there are new actors who want to get on the stage. India and Pakistan were very happy to get nuclear weapons. They both of their governments have said, yeah, we're writing the next chapter in the book on, deterrence. This book should not get too long. This book should be short and over. So the problem is, if you get nuclear weapons in the hands of people who do not have this regard for human life and who do not care if their own people, are nuked, then you're going to have a problem because there will not be the political will not to use them. So it is still a scary time. And this is, what happens with technologies is this is part of cultural evolution. Things don't get uninvented. You see in biology, it's strange to say, we can come back to this main point if you want. Biological evolution is not reversible. That is to say, if we evolved from monkeys, we don't see people going back to monkeys. It's not reversible at all. It just continues to progress in some way, but it's not reversible. Cultural evolution is reversible. This is the saving grace. So if we evolve unfortunate weapons, we can also not use them. We can also, disable them. Although that's difficult for us to do, we are not compelled to use every tool that we invent. That's what I'm saying.
So how do we arrive to this will of peace and stop pretending that we are isolated on this planet? And to arrive to that place where we understand that we do have a responsibility for everyone.
Yeah. Well, you just said it. We're not isolated. And I think this is a positive aspect of globalization, actually. This is something which Indian philosophy and Buddhism taught many, many millennia ago. They taught about the interconnectedness of all beings. If you believe in God, and we're interconnected that way, as in the Hindu system, if you don't need to have God in the equation necessarily, because there's a Buddhist doctrine of interconnectedness, which is even more philosophically interesting, I believe. But in any case, it's teaching that we're all interconnected. This was a teaching that was out there in the world long before we became aware of other people in the world and other civilizations in the world. But now, listen, nobody is disconnected, right? Globalization is great in the sense that we can email anybody if they have access to the internet. Nobody can be isolated anymore, and this makes us potentially more human in our awareness of each other's humanity. This interconnectedness is a very good thing. More people are traveling than ever. More people are visiting different countries, different cultures, and at the end of the day, learning that we're all human beings, no matter how different our programs are. Fundamentally, the thing that's running this program is one entity called the human being. So this is all positive. This makes it more difficult for those with a political agenda or with political ill will, to impose on us a program that says, we have to hate or we have to, have enemies. So there's a positive aspect to this, okay? But the will has been very generally an underutilized resource, and that's a philosophical point which we need Slade to hammer home, that even in the West, where we have choices and we have, more freedoms than other places perhaps, the will is still underutilized. People are brought up to believe that they're victims of circumstance. We have this whole culture of victimology, victimhood, like we have no say in anything. We're all, subjected to things and we can't help it. So people tend to look outside themselves for solutions rather than inside, where I think it's really important for philosophers in particular to make people more mindful that the power of will is probably one of the strongest powers we have.
Being victimized is one thing, because there's natural progress where we kind of move on from there, isn't there? But the problem is when we start to identify ourselves with being a victim, and we get stuck in a victimology loop where we become stagnant, and it seems like we just can't move on from there.
Yeah, and I think people are realizing that victimology kind of had its high tide in the 90s, pretty much. I'm hoping. And now people are realizing that they can be active players in their own future. We're not fated to be this, that, or the other thing. We also choose, or by abdicating choice, allow others to manipulate us. But people have great power. Will can make all the difference in your life. And what we need in our education system, I believe, is actually more attentiveness to willpower.
Now, that's an interesting combination of words, will of peace and education. So what kind of education system are you referring to?
Well, there's nothing I know of right now, but I'm referring to something so new it hasn't even been done. I mean, where in any school, I don't remember taking a course at Willpower 101. Have you ever seen that course? If people had more willpower, if people were able to utilize more of their capacities, in terms of willing things, then they would be much more efficient in their lives, much more self-actualizing, much less dependent on external resources to solve their problems. Of course, we need others, and we'll always need others. But I'm talking about things like states of mind. Who's in charge of your mind? You are. And if you're thinking thoughts which are not entirely positive or not entirely helpful to you, or if you're caught up, in some kind of, unhappy thought patterns, if the program you're running, in other words, is not helping you so much in life, you may be tempted to, to think that you need a diagnosis and a prescription drug to solve your problems. That's the antithesis of will. People, if they use willpower more, would be able to simply accomplish more in their lives, be more self-confident, more self-reliant, and would be less dependent on external technologies.
Yeah, I just love that thinking, taking charge of my will, building my will by taking charge of my thinking, and to choose the programming that I want rather than having it externally pressed upon me from society. And then there's a question of how we begin to dialogue with the system that we belong to. How do we bridge that? Perhaps reducing everything to commonalities, a common denominator. What do we have in common? For example, I am alive. I have children. I love life. I love my children. So these commonalities is the beginnings of a healthy conversation, is it not?
Sure. And we want our children, presumably, to live in a world in which they will have at least adequate opportunities for education, for decent food, decent housing, and opportunities in life. And if our system can't provide our children with some reasonable expectation of a useful and contributive life, then our system is failing. And unfortunately, in Europe, we see these huge unemployment problems. Spain has it. France has it. Most Western European nations and EU nations actually have huge unemployment problems right now. And this is a cultural evolution taking, basically a turn which is going to challenge people to reinvent themselves. And as educators, we don't even know anymore. I'm trying to tell you the truth. If we sit down and try and plan an education system that's going to enable more people to find jobs, what's that going to look like? I'm not even so sure, because technologies themselves are not predictable entirely. We don't necessarily know what's going to be useful 5 or 10 years, down the road. But I can tell you for sure that the common denominator things, the capacities we have as human beings to will, and also to appreciate one another and to cultivate our best inner resources, those things can only serve our better interests regardless of what form the employment market takes.
So the new education system would definitely have an element that would contribute to the development of the greater and higher self in all education systems. Okay, so that's an important thing, regardless of in addition to all the needs of the society itself. Okay, and also you mentioned the last time that I interviewed you in Barcelona, something that I've been thinking a lot about. You mentioned that we do not need to wake up with an enemy.
Yeah, that's my question. Do you need when you get up in the morning, do you need an enemy? If you need an enemy when you get up in the morning, contemplate changing your operating system. Okay, that's what I'm saying. So whatever program, part of your program is running that needs this enemy in order to run, consider that is not serving you very well, and probably not serving these other people very well either, whom you consider your enemies. Friendly competition is one thing, okay? And constructive competition is fine among athletes or among whatever it is. It makes us all better. But having the idea of an enemy means harboring notions of hatred or dehumanizing somebody. This is not healthy for anybody. It's a negative mind state. So I would get rid of that. Purge this word enemy from your mind, from your program. Regard people as being human, just like you are, and ask yourself, why is it that you need to, because they believe something different from you, or they have a different name for God, or they, why would that be the basis of a violent conflict or of negative emotions? It makes no sense.
Yeah, it just makes sense. It makes more sense to focus on what we do have in common and our commonalities than what makes us different in the first place. Okay, Lou, so here I'm born. I've been given my parents by chance. I've been given my country by chance. I did not decide even to be born, and I was given my religion by chance, my primary education system. And I go through and I turn 18 now, and I'm in charge of my own programming.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm being asked to take the responsibility to go through and to actively decide which cultural programs have value for me.
Right.
as well as the programs that no longer serve me.
Yes, and in fact, you don't have to throw everything out. We're not saying to you you have to, devalue your own culture or your own upbringing or your own family. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that you inherited a lot of things which are extremely useful and good, but also probably you got what Korzybski called some emery in the lubricant. And you got to try and get that out of there. Change the stories, modify the stories in a way if you need to. I mean, everything evolves. Religions evolve, cultures evolve, right? When people, identify with a political party, that evolves over time. Everything is moving, right? Cultural evolution, like biological evolution, moves and changes from one generation to the next. And it changes because people inject new ideas into the culture and they get picked up and absorbed. It's a really interesting process.
Yeah, and it all seems to have to happen without force. I mean, I can't force myself on other people. Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with me.
Yeah, it has to, because you can't impose peace. We said this, you cannot impose peace on people. They have to impose it on themselves. If you're going to be, nobody can force you to be at peace with the world. That's a contradiction in terms. If I put a gun to your head and say, be at peace with me, that's impossible.
Oh, okay, no problem. So, in other words, within this non-forced freedom, I have the responsibility, and there's choice involved here, to begin a major initiative, a major cleaning, a house cleaning, to begin a major house cleaning from the inside of myself, inside out.
All of us are. You sound like René Descartes. This is what he was trying to do in a more modest way. He was saying, well, how do I get rid of false beliefs? How do I distinguish between things which I've been told which are true, and things which are false, or things that I've come to believe which are true and things which are false? How do I do that? And he said, I would like to have only true beliefs at the end of the day, and I would like to get rid of everything that is false and even everything that is uncertain. So that was his project. Of course, once he started doing this, he realized it was much more challenging than meets the eye. It's not just like making up a laundry list, and saying, well, okay, I need this, I don't need that. But I think that the responsibility factor is an important one. And there are lots of philosophers, not just, one particular school, but many schools of philosophy who do emphasize this idea that because, we have choices, because we have freedom, therefore we are responsible. And it's only when we're willing to take responsibility that we can really make positive change in our lives.
It reminds me of this little girl, Malala Yousafzai, who's from Pakistan and who was shot in the head for going to school.
Yes.
She has turned out to be one of the biggest advocates as far as education goes, especially among women and girls and women. What Malala understands is that with education comes freedom. There comes an awareness, there comes a higher sense of consciousness, there comes an empowerment. And with empowerment, and that's the last thing that the extremists want. So education seems to be a very, very important step, doesn't it?
It's a vital step, absolutely vital step. Aristotle, even back in his day, said that the difference between a well-educated and a non-educated person is almost like the difference between the living and the dead. If you are unfortunate enough not to have acquired an education at all, then it's almost like sleepwalking through life. People who are not able to have insight or questions or to take responsibilities and make decisions. Somehow it's very dehumanizing. This very courageous Pakistani girl, she was shot. She's advocating, of course, women's education. And we know that in many societies, men and women are still segregated by gender, and that roles are assigned on the basis of biology as opposed to the basis of culture. We're back to that again. If you allow biology to dictate culture, then you're going to get this kind of very repressive system.
Yeah, and she didn't stop there. She also wanted education for the children of the extremists and the extremists themselves to be educated.
Well, this is back to Gandhi. Gandhi didn't hate the British for occupying India and for exploiting Indians, economically and politically and in other ways. There was no hatred in him. There was no thought that these are my enemies that I have to, defeat. His idea was that you use moral force. This is willpower activating another great power that all humans have, namely moral force. And he said, by becoming a mirror, my oppressor will eventually see himself in this mirror and understand that his actions are wrong. And only by being a mirror to my oppressor, only by holding up that mirror, I must then convince my oppressor to understand that he is wrong to oppress me, that's the only way to get them to change. If I try and use force or violence or coercion, they will only become more justifiably entrenched in their own position. They will just dig in.
It's interesting that there seems to need to be a foundation of love already available. I mean, I'm talking agape, the Greek word agape, the pure love, available before we even get to making those decisions.
Yeah, that's easier said than done, but he did, and he did this by practicing spiritual exercises. As you know, he was an exceptional person. But the point is that he did this because he believed everybody, all his followers, were standing up in the same way and not retaliating. You know, and it's not nonviolent in the sense that it draws. They were attracting violence at times for themselves, but absorbing it with love, as you say, absorbing it with agape and not retaliating. And eventually the British did understand. I mean, they weren't even that slow learners. It took a while. But they did understand that they were simply wrong. It was unjust of them to be running India, and that really, you know, to be just, they had to leave India in the hands of Indians and let them have their own political self-determination. And they did. Now, you know, Dr. Martin Luther King did the same thing in the United States with his direct action program in order to, you know, more or less end segregation in the South. He needed a lot of help from the government, but also he did this in the same way as Gandhi. Now, the thing is, it's more difficult to do in cultures where there is more dogma and less liberty built in. Remember, the British did not murder Gandhi, right?
No, they just imprisoned him.
They just jailed him. And then they had a real problem because he got more powerful in jail. When they put him, every time they put him in jail, he had more time to write and to make, you know, and to do the political work. So being in jail was just a way for him to gather strength. And the same thing with Dr. King. And they all got this from Thoreau. I mean, this is all, you know, thanks to Henry David Thoreau and his tract on civil disobedience. This guy spent one night in jail because Thoreau, you know, was against slavery. He was against the war in Mexico, which was a war of acquisition, and he refused to pay some poll tax, which, you know, would have gone to funding that. So they put him in jail for a night, and his friends bailed him out the next day. They paid the tax, and Thoreau was really pissed off because he wanted to stay in jail, but his friends bailed him out. And so he wrote this, you know, but he was a dramatist, so he wrote this great thing called Civil Disobedience, and he says in there, in an unjust society, you know, the place for a just man is a prison. Well, which is very moving, you know, but he spent one night. I mean, the thing is that Thoreau spent one night, but King read this, and Gandhi read this, and they spent many more than one, you know, they spent more than one night. But it was really to good effect. What I'm saying to you, Slade, is that not every culture is like this, because if you tried this in Nazi Germany, they would have killed you.
Yes, they wouldn't have hesitated.
That's the difference, and this was a big debate, because people wrote to Gandhi from occupied, you know, Europe, and they said, how can we resist the Nazis using your way? They said, they'll just kill us. And Gandhi thought it would work, but they said, no, it won't. Because this culture, the Nazis had no moral sensibility at all. I mean, they did, but it was so buried so deep under all this horrible program they were running of hatred and violence and murder that they couldn't get, you know, they were not able, you know, it was the same thing with Stalin during the purges or Mao during the Cultural Revolution. Here we go, Cultural Revolution. You couldn't protest it in any way because if you did, they'd just kill you.
You'd likely end up dead.
So it doesn't always work. What I'm trying to say is...
Well, then it's like trying to awaken a collective sense of morality, isn't it?
Right, exactly right. If your oppressor is somebody with moral sensibility, you know, which is close enough to the surface, you can touch it, you can activate it. You still may have to absorb, you know, some unjustness and maybe even violent treatment, and maybe you'll get beaten up and so forth. But if you can actualize the moral sensibility of your oppressor, they will stop oppressing you, but they have to be able to be educable. Now, some people are very slow learners, or some cultural programs are going to suppress that moral sensibility so deeply that you're not going to be able to touch it, and they're just going to kill you. And so that's the real problem. How do you work with people who don't want to talk to you? How do you talk to people who don't want to talk to you? That's the fundamental problem.
Yeah. It's difficult when people don't want to talk to you. I was just thinking that in light of tyrant states and heavy dogmatic states, where cultures are literally turned in on themselves or living in a state of fear that do not want a dialogue, we might not be in such a bad position as we were years ago. Maybe this is an example of how we have evolved culturally. It's much harder for dogmatic states to lock down their populations than it was before, because we now have access to grassroots networks around the world globally that we did not have before.
Yes, I mean, all of this, and there are many people in the world doing this work. And I think that one of the main lessons of globalization is, just as anybody could throw something up on the web that might go viral, right? Anybody. You never know. You can't predict it because you're touching, the big, deep currents of globalized opinion. And anybody could put something on the web that goes viral. You don't have to be a big corporation to do that. You can't even necessarily engineer that, even if you paid for the advertising space. So it means that each individual has potentially enormous power to influence others. This is one of the messages of interconnectedness, that we're all global. Even though we're acting locally, we're thinking globally. And this means that what you're saying is better favored now than it was 100 or 200 years ago, when you could be carrying on some really important, kind of educational activity, and maybe nobody would even know about it. Mm-hmm. Use globalization in our favor. This is still going to take time for dogmatic cultural programs which are afraid of change, basically, and resistant to change. They need to be worked on, I think, very patiently. And people have to be willing to make sacrifices to change them. I'm sorry to say there's no other way. And I'm not saying, and please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that our system is perfect or whatever it is that we have in the West. I'm not saying that we're superior. I'm not. We have also way too much, sometimes too much liberty for our own good. I mean, if you look at the promiscuity and the divorce rate and there's a lot of stuff which, I think that more conservative cultures are very rightly concerned about. They don't necessarily want their young daughters to be Playboy pinups or whatever it is, Mm-hmm. I mean, they could be justifiably concerned about the exploitation of sexuality and about pornography and about things which they think are not necessarily good for moral culture either. Just because we have the freedom to do everything doesn't mean that everything is right either.
Yeah, I can see that. And perhaps one of our greatest failings as liberty and freedom is concerned is the lack of taking the responsibility to continue to evolve. And hopefully we can without regressing too much. Now, Lou, if a listener is listening to this program on cultural evolution and are wanting to make a change, a contribution to help the culture evolve, it seems like you have a two-pronged message here. One is internal change, and the second one is external change. Is that right?
No, the two are one. I mean, the outside and the inside are connected too. So the first steps are really important. To change yourself, that's really important. To be clear within yourself and to develop yourself, if you can do that, that's really important. Then everything else follows from this. Okay, if you're just going to be an activist without changing yourself primarily or understanding what you're doing, then you may or may not help. You could make things worse as well. But I would say that everybody has more power than they probably realize. And this is, in terms of being connected to others and affecting others. So I think it's a great opportunity. People can and should become activists to whatever extent they're prepared to do it and find a good cause and work for it, try and make the world a better place, and it will become a better place. This much, I'm pretty convinced about. And how you do this, there are 1,001 things in the world that need to be improved. So it doesn't even matter in a sense what you choose. However, there are some things that are more urgent than others. And I would just hope that we can humanize a lot of political cultures, that particularly some of the more dogmatic religions in the world need to understand that they can give people a little bit more room for self-development, and they won't necessarily be jeopardizing, their own status as, organized religions. I think that equally or more important leadership issues are predominant now, that we have in the world very enlightened leaders, and we also have very brutal leaders. And we need to somehow figure out a way to reduce the amount of brutality that goes on, the corruption, which is endemic in some places, and really militates against the betterment of humanity as a whole. There are any number of challenges in the world, but I do want to encourage people to, as you've said, to realize that they can take action and that it will have a result.
Lou, you mentioned while you were here in Barcelona in the Conflictology conference that we need to have more media dedicated to higher concepts or philosophy. Can you say more about this?
Yeah. Well, what Americans have noticed, and maybe it's the same in Spain, I don't know, but Americans have certainly noticed that media outlets tend to crystallize. They have an agenda. I mean, if you have a free press, then everyone's free to have their own point of view and to express it, right? So, I mean, if you're free to run a radio station, you're free to express your views, and it should be that way. What happens with the mainstream media is that they get very hardened and very siloed in their own views, and they have these agendas, basically. It becomes an agenda. And then people get sick and tired 24/7. You know what certain media are going to say. No matter what happens, you know the spin they're going to put on it because that's their agenda, right? So that's where freedom becomes dogma in the end. So I'm saying that you all have to be your own, you all have to be your own sources now. People have to come up with their own ideas and not be swindled or deceived, or hoodwinked or seduced by mainstream media, which can be very powerful. But again, you have this wonderful thing called the World Wide Web, so people can blog, people can put up their own points of view, and people can be read. If you're tired of getting what the state feeds you or what the large economic interests feed you, you always have an opportunity now to look at what independent thinkers are saying on the web. And once again, that's a wonderful manifestation of liberty. So yeah, I encourage people to do that. As far as philosophy is concerned, yes, we need a lot more. There is hardly any in the mainstream, really at all. And people need to be encouraged. I think that basically that a lot of the powers that be don't want people to question things. This is an old story, because people who are free to question may come up with answers which will be embarrassing or uncomfortable or inexpedient, for the entrenched authorities. So naturally, the less the people think, the better off they are, But as a philosopher, I'd have to say, for humanity, the best way forward is for us all to become philosophical at certain points. And you know why? I'll tell you why. It's really simple. You put in the same room a bunch of philosophers, Slade, and they will disagree on absolutely everything, right? There's no two philosophers who agree about anything at the end of it. Yeah. But you know what? We're not killing each other over the differences. That's the difference. That's the thing. You put a bunch of philosophers in the room who disagree on everything under the sun. They're not killing each other. They're not at war with each other. They may, like Newton, take a few, like verbal snipes at one another. But basically, we're not killing each other. We're not violent. We're willing to dialogue. We're willing to discuss. And that makes all the difference in the world. So in other words, we don't have to all be the same to get along. We can get along just fine and celebrate our differences and develop even more understanding because of them. And this is the message that needs to get out to the political and the economic and the religious forces in the world, that you've got to give people room to be different.
Okay, so cultural evolution is not something that just happens. There's a choice involved, and we can move it forward. And the place to begin is right in our own home, in our own heart.
We're all running a program, and we have the power to change that program, modify it, upgrade it, and make it better, make it even better than it is. And that's cultural evolution in a nutshell.
And interconnectivity seems to be an important point as well.
That is one of the big keys. We're not different species. We just treat each other sometimes as though we were. But we're actually one and the same species, just different cultural garbs.
Different garbs. I like that. Dr. Lou Marinoff, thank you so much again for joining us here on Authenticity Radio.
You're more than welcome, Slade. It's always a pleasure speaking with you.
This is Slade Suter. Until next time, be authentic, be true, choose to evolve culturally, and be free.
Don't worry. Be happy. In every life we have some trouble. When you worry, you make it double. Don't worry. Be happy. Don't worry. Be happy.
Conflict is a choice you know. Whoa, watch it! Sorry. In order to gain a new perspective and how to resolve conflict in your organization, business, or family, go to authenticityradio.com. All right, enough.
This is Authenticity Radio.
Hey, I'm Talisa.
The station's awesome.
I love this station. I love the station.